Hello and welcome to the second part of the Tournament Administration webinar. We will be discussing what is on typically a notice to players, like local rules and the items included on the hard card, which includes related to code of conduct. The committee is responsible for using a notice to players, often known as a hard card, which should contain things as the terms of the competition, unless stated elsewhere, such as an entry form. And the NCGA will often list the terms of the competition on a separate document other than the hard card or notice to the players, also known as our player information sheets. The local rules adopted for the competition, which can include the competition-specific rules, like course-specific rules, or even code of conduct that would apply to all NCGA competitions. And it is necessary for the players to have access to the notice of players and hard card. They may not necessarily read the documents, but they should be able to access them either through the electronic means or some physical copy. Notice to players can include specific local rules, notices if it is unique or special for the course, like reminding players in the notice that they may practice on a practice putting green during the round if it is common that there will be backup on the first or 10th tees and there's a practice green nearby. However, if you wouldn't state the relief procedure for taking relief for an immovable obstruction on a notice to players. The notice to players should be posted in advance and/or a supply should be on the hand at the starting tees. Some NCGA events provide physical copies of the notice and some upload them to the tournament information page, but both are done for championships. The committee may establish local rules for local abnormal conditions if they're consistent with the policy set forth in Section 8 of the committee procedures. So in Section 8 is the area in the committee guide that lists all the different types of special conditions in which you would adopt a local rule for. Things specifically to the competitions or use of specific equipment, defining who may give or help give advice if there's advice givers in events, defining when and where players may practice. Procedures for bad weather and suspension of play. We put that information on the NCGA's hard card so players know when we have suspended play. And pace of play policies are very important and should be included in the information that needs to be given to the players in advance. Course specific rules talks about how we mark our courses for out of bounds. There's different ways to mark it, the penalty areas and how they're marked and identified, bunkers, putting greens, special required relief procedures throughout the course if necessary. And then any abnormal course conditions or integral objects or things that the committee has decided are integral to the play of the game. These are the local rules apply at all NCGA events. Aeration holes is a perfect example of something that we don't want the players to have to play out of, and we don't know necessarily when they'll pop up. So just to cover ourselves, all aeration holes players are entitled to relief for, and there is a different procedure for when it's on the putting green versus it is in the general area. Transportation and caddies. If it is desired to require players to walk in a competition, the following term is suggested, and it's a pretty simple local rule that says the players must walk at all times during a stipulated round. In the NCGA Amateur and stroke play championships are example where events where players are required to walk. Players may use push carts, including electronic versions of push carts during NCGA competitions even when players are required to walk, they can use push carts. And NCGA Junior Tour events, players are also required to walk and not ride. If a motorized cart are used during the competition, we got to create a policy so the players understand when they can ride and who can ride in the cart. So this infographic was created by the USGA for their Senior Amateur Championship. The NCGA does allow players and caddies to ride together as long as there is a seat available. There's times where two players are both chosen to ride, and so then the caddy must walk. So the USGA, working a senior amateur championship or qualifier, be aware that this infographic is important to understand the policy for who can ride in the cart. Obviously, if we're going to suspend play, we do need the players to know how we're going to do so. And when they hear the horn blow, they need to understand whether or not it's a dangerous situation and they must stop immediately, or is it a situation in which they can complete the hole. So those are good, important notes to include in a terms of competition or local rules. This is a common local rule, model local rule A3. When we've got a public road that runs through a golf course, we'd like to say that it's very common. We'll adopt this local rule. And because it really isn't fair, if a ball comes to rest on the road, it would be considered out of bounds because it's a public road. We don't want players to play off this public road. And usually those public roads are out of bounds. So if a ball came to rest there, we would say the player was out of bounds. If it went beyond the road and came to rest on another part of the golf course, so it shouldn't be inbounds because a player who's actually played a worse shot would be considered inbounds versus a player who played a bad shot that ended up in a bad place on the road. So whenever you have this situation on your golf course, we do recommend that anything beyond that road would also be considered out of bounds. Local Rule B1 in regards to how we define penalty areas. The USGA in 2019 changed the way in which we identify penalty areas, and the committee can really define anything they want to be a penalty area. But they do need the players to know what they're using to identify those penalty areas. And it may not just be paint lines, it may not be just stakes, it may be other things. A player needs to know though, is it the mow line that's being used on a specific hole? Or is it some other rock wall that may be defining the penalty area? So here's some example, a desert area with our red penalty areas at the edge of the penalty areas where the grass and the desert meet. Gives a pretty good description so the player knows where their ball lies. And obviously we understand that in the rules of golf, it is very important to know where the ball lies. Our E10 local rule is protection of young trees. Now, this is a local rule that has to be adopted for a competition. It can't just be applied everywhere because there are plenty of trees that have stakes that are not necessarily identified. So it's not a local rule that is always in place. It is common that larger trees may have stakes as well, but they don't need protecting. And when setting up a tournament, you should talk to the superintendent and find out what trees they're trying to protect. Maybe a specific hole in which you're going to identify trees that are needing protection, or it could be throughout the golf course where they've planted a bunch of newer trees that they're trying to protect. And when this local rule is in effect, you also have to decide, are they getting relief for the tree? They by definition get relief for the stake because the stake is an obstruction by definition. So you would have to mention that information in your local rule. Then also the committee should decide whether or not they want to grant relief from the tree well surrounding the tree as part of this local rule. Model local rule F5, our 2 and 2 local rule. And this is a very common local rule, but should only be adopted when it's common that players will be putting around the greens and movable obstructions would interfere. It's not something you would adopt at every golf course. We use it here, obviously, at Poppy Hills because the areas surrounding the putting greens where there are obstructions, players would most likely be playing a shot along the ground. For a player to be able to get relief, they must meet the following criteria. The ball must be in the general area as 2 club lengths from the obstruction. The obstruction must be 2 club lengths from the putting green, and the player must also have interference on their line of play. See in this description and picture, clearly the player has interference on their line of play. Does not have to be adopted for the entire course, and they may want to include all types of obstructions. They may just say sprinkler heads, or they could say sprinkler control boxes, whatever they decide, but the committee should be very specific in what they're trying to grant relief for. It's very common the committee will adopt the provisions that the ball and the obstruction must be in an area cut to fairway height or less. So there's some extra options. Are close to the putting green, and you got your relief procedures here. This player has the extra to take relief if it's close to the putting green and on the line of play. That's where we get our relief under this local rule. So you could see here, player has interference, player takes their relief over here and drops 1 club length from their established reference point. And that's obviously no relief if it's clearly unreasonable for a player to be able to play a stroke. In this case, it's very clearly that they would be able to play a stroke. They clearly have interference. They're going to go to their nearest point of relief and drop within a club length so that they no longer have interference from this condition. And that's what this rule describes is our reference point's been established. Our size of relief area is 1 club length, and it's going to be required to be dropped in the general area within 1 club length of the reference point. Our other model local rules, F6 and F7, describe that a player is not entitled to relief for their stance from an abnormal course condition. And this occasionally adopted, the NCGA will occasionally adopt this local rule. And they do so because there's times where there's so many animal holes near a hole where they were taking relief out beyond the area of the golf course in which you would normally play, beyond the fairway, beyond the rough. And by the time they get relief from the animal holes, they've dropped almost in the fairway. So we do want to make sure that they're keeping in the general area in which their ball originally came to rest. So when there's a lot of animal holes in a specific area, you may just only adopt the local rule, this particular local rule that grants relief for live ball and area intended swing, but not part of the stance. And the other part of this local rules has to do with our sod seams. Our sod seam local rules on the NCGA hard card, and it specifically says the player is not entitled to relief for their stance if they're standing on a sod seam, because sod seams obviously wouldn't necessarily affect a player much if they're just standing on it, but we do grant relief for live ball and area of intended swing. Model rule F7, like I said, is on the hard card, interferes with the player's stance, does not get relief, but does get relief if it affects their stroke and the live ball. The committee is always right, even when they are wrong, but should not make their own rules. The game of golf has a set of rules, and that is what we are here to enforce as the NCGA. So we don't adopt local rules that are not in line with the model local rules that are in the committee guide. In addition, committees must not write local rules that goes beyond any authorized local rule, and it is important to point out that this specifically calls out that preferred lies should not be used in the entire general area. Only in the fairway of the hole being played should be used. When has a scorecard been returned? It is important that the starters tell the players where they need to go to turn in or certify their scores with the committee before leaving. If they haven't been told and they leave the course, they may be exempt from penalty. So it's important for the starters to give them this information. And the committee is there to help them resolve any issues before certifying the scores. So we want to make sure they stop by and see the committee to make sure that that is being taken care of. We don't want to hurry a player out of the scoring area. Let them hang out. Don't be afraid to expand your scoring area to include the entire clubhouse. Or in some cases, you might include even the parking lot. But we're not looking to penalize players. So you could look at defining the areas a specific way. We do have events where they do electronic scoring only, but we do have to go through the verification process. We want them to stop by and see us to make sure that we all agree that these scores that have been entered in on their cell phones are accurate. NCGA's player conduct. The player conduct rules are on the hard card. Listening to music during an event is prohibited, and the committee starts with a warning. So if a player is listening to music when they're not allowed to, we will give them a warning. It won't be a penalty unless they continue to do it after their original warning. And serious misconduct issues not only gets the player disqualified, but also comes with a minimum of a 3-year suspension. So these, whenever there is this serious misconduct disqualification, it's brought to the golf committee, and they will decide if 3 years or more will be added to this player's suspension from NCGA events. So this concludes the second portion of the tournament administration seminar, and we look forward to seeing you over on the third portion.